Hi, I'm Dr. Simon Walker. I'm currently an academic working at the University of Glasgow, the University of Strathclyde and Glasgow Caledonian University, and I'm making this quick video on how to write a really great history/humanities essay, because I want you, as possibly my current students or future students or anybody who's currently in university or even college or even school, to have the best tools so you can write the best essay. So I hope this is useful, and good luck with your essays. So firstly, I'm going to take you through a small acronym. It's an acronym that I only came up recently, but it's something I've been saying for a long time. It's just one of my classes pointed out to me that I can't spell, which everybody knew, and they helped me rearrange it, so fair play to them. But the acronym for writing a really great humanities essay is SLEEP. S-L-E-E-P. Now this stands for the 5 core functions I believe are integral to a really great essay. We start off with S for structure. We then move into L for linkage, then E for explanation, another E for evidence, and finally a P for presentation. And the remainder of this video will talk you through these core sections and hopefully really help you with your essay writing. So let's jump straight in. Starting with S, structure. Structure is one of those core facets of writing an essay which is so integral that often it can get lost. The structure element is the idea of planning and structuring your essay so clearly that the information that you're trying to put across is clear and easy to mark, easy to read, easy to recognize. Remember, when you're writing your essays, they are to be marked. The idea is that you are demonstrating knowledge and making points as set to you by your tutor, your lecturer, whoever has set you that essay. So it's really important that you make that as clear as possible to give us the opportunity to give you the highest mark we can. So in terms of structure, you tend to look at 3 core aspects, the first one being the introduction, then you've got the sections of your essay, and then finally your conclusion. Now, your introduction should not be an opportunity for you to do an info dump. It should start off with an introduction to the question, cover a wee bit of context, possibly with some references, and then lead into how you're going to answer the question. Not the answer for the question, but how you intend to tackle it, i.e. what is the journey plan of your essay to come. The clearer this can be and the better written, the better the essay. As I said, this is not an opportunity for you to tell us the answer, it's the opportunity for you to tell me how you are going to answer the question set. Then you'll have your sections, and then you'll have a conclusion. Now your sections are the core facets of your argument. Within your introduction, your journey plan should point out your key elements. We call these themes typically in history because we're looking for thematic essays. They are essays that use thematic elements to make the arguments. Very rarely do we look for chronological essays. We don't want you to take us from 0 to 100. We want you to talk through the key themes that are related to the question we've asked. Now you can use these themes as sections, and within those sections you can break it down further, and I'll talk to you about that later on. But the key thing is to highlight what you're doing, then do it, and then in your conclusion to give a summation, an overview, not to give us the answer again, not to give new information, and not to end with a boom. That we don't need that. What we need you to do is overview what you've said. Essentially, it is a mirror image of your introduction. So much so that once you've written your introduction, your sections and your conclusion, I'd recommend that you take your introduction, your conclusion, strike a line through them as a draft 1, and then rewrite an introcon, which is a reflection that splits down the middle of the beginning and the end. This will mean that you're on par with what you've just written in case anything shifted, and it means you know that you're clear. That's your structure. Then we move into linkage. Linkage fits really well into structure because as the structure goes forward, you continually need to make sure that you're answering the question. To quote a famous sci-fi movie, stay on target. What you need to do is be able to go back to what is written, as in what is the question that has been set and what you've written, and show that you're making progress. So for example, at the end of a paragraph, you want to make sure that you've linked it back to the question set or what you've just said. Your linkage is really important as you move throughout your essay. You have to keep it clear that you know where you're going and signpost for the reader where you're going so they can keep up. Linkage is key, and we'll come on to this a little bit more in the next section. Obviously, bang smack in the middle, explanation. In many ways, this is almost so obvious that it tends to get overlooked, because obviously that's what you need to do. You need to have a clear explanation in relation to the question that we've asked. Whether that's a question of explain, debate, argue, agree, disagree, etc. Right? So all these kind of questions, they always ask you to present an argument and information. But the point here is it's not just the presentation of information, particularly at university level. We're not looking for black and white answers or factual elements all the way through. We do want factual elements, but we don't just want this data, this data, that kind of thing. That doesn't answer anything. We're looking for you to utilize your knowledge and, most importantly, your research. So your explanation has to be intricate and it has to be backed up by evidence, which is something I'll come on to in the next section. Here I introduce another one of my core sayings, which is state, debate, relate. State, debate, relate. Going back to your structure, I said that you would have sections, and within those sections you would argue key points. So let's take a 3,000 word essay. For me, I would expect to see three core themes, three core sections. But within that section, there will be 2 or 3 smaller sections. Usually, these would be paragraphs. Now, paragraphs are really important because as you are presenting your essay, you will realize that markers tend to give you comments back at the end of a paragraph. It's the logical place to do it. You get to the end of a paragraph, you think that was a really good point, or that could have been clearer, you make a comment on it. These are subconscious marking elements. So marking points. So make sure that your paragraphs are clear, that they're not too large, but they're also not so small that you haven't said anything and they become pointless. Best paragraph for me would be one that follows state, debate, relate. So it opens by stating the point of the paragraph. What is the key little element you want to talk about? For example, if you're writing an essay about technology in the First World War, this might be your section on tanks. Or it might be the biggest your large section may be on tanks, and this might be on the arguments against tanks or on how dangerous they were, etc. So your opening gambit, your opening statement for that paragraph will be tanks were incredibly controversial when they were first introduced in the First World War. Nice opening sentence. Then you want to debate it. So state, debate, relate. You've stated, we're now debating. How do you debate? Well, obviously you can debate by you writing what you think, which is great, but it won't get you the marks you want. Because what we really need is for you to take what you think and demonstrate how you know it through evidence. And that is the arguments of historians, of theorists, of thinkers, of writers, of academic writers, and or primary source analysis, i.e. sources from that time. If you're doing a source analysis, for example, you can validate that by either comparing it to another source and see if there's correlation, see if they corroborate each other, or by carrying out looking at the secondary literature and seeing if other people have made the same argument and have also looked at other sources. Essentially, out there are thousands of hard-working, underappreciated, often incredibly great-looking historians who've written books and articles that have been peer-reviewed and run through the Mensa before they get anywhere near you. These works are your lifeline to writing great essays. We've done the hard work. We've cried the tears over them. Trust me. Use it instead of just trying to get it to guess or write an analysis without your backup. And I'll come back to evidence in a wee section. But the point here is that if you're doing your state, debate, relate, you've done your state, you've stated that tanks were controversial when they were introduced in the First World War. Then you would possibly go on to say that Smith argues that tanks were particularly controversial because they had propensity to being targeted on the battlefront. Now, that would be a quote, but it's the difference between dropping in a quote and introducing a quote. If you drop in a quote, as in use quotation marks and then a citation, or maybe not a citation, it doesn't tell us much. You've just thrown a quote in. Great, good luck. But if you introduce it, who said it, you've then set the tone for your following on argument. So you've said that Smith argues, and then you can discuss it more. You could say something like, this is potentially because they were bulky and slow moving, and indeed many soldiers were targeted as they travelled in slow metal boxes working towards the enemy over terrible terrain. You could even reference again, because you could be paraphrasing from another academic, and that's acceptable there. You could do a counter-analysis, where you could go on and say, however, Jones argues that the metal utilised in the tanks actually protected soldiers and was therefore a valuable form of moving shield that was decisive in the First World War. Quote again. Now, if you know anything about tanks, you know that's nonsense. Tanks were slightly decisive, but for the most part they were dangerous, they exploded, they got really hot, they weren't particularly successful. They were later on, but in the earlier stages they were a huge disaster. So you'd be able to argue that, and maybe back it up with some references as well. The point here is that you've taken a statement, tanks were controversial, and then you've discussed it by saying Smith argues, Jones disagrees, and your own information. You could even throw in something as a primary source to back up your particular point of view. Let's say that you're arguing that tanks were more or less useless and dangerous. You could take a report from the First World War from a war general that states the new tank interventions were not particularly useful and led to significant more deaths on the front line. However, the men were able to hide behind them as they tried to move forward. If you've got access to that information and it's a proper source, brilliant. Reference it, highlight it, I'll give you a tick. Can you see how I'm constructing it together? Statement, state, debate, and then we relate. So at the end of that wee paragraph, and it should still only be a paragraph, if it's a really big point you're making, you may want to pull it across 2 paragraphs, and that's where your relate comes in. We're back to linkage. So you can link it to the next paragraph by saying something like, there were, however, many supporters of the tank, as will be discussed in the next section. I'm not overly fussed on that. I think it's a bit chaotic, a bit clunky, but if you're struggling for words, you could do it. Or you could relate it back to the question and say something like, clearly tanks were not the invention that it was hoped that they would be. However, they would go on to become a useful military tool. However, in the First World War, tanks often were more of a hindrance than a help. Lovely kind of summation. Back to the question, on to your next section. Can you see how what you're doing is you're reiterating the points that you've made? You want to maintain a narrative flow and direct the reader to either the next paragraph or to remind them of the argument that you're making. Add that all together, it makes for a very clear, concise, and intricately argued essay. So the next point is about evidence. So much of this has already been covered because I've talked to you about how to use evidence within your state, debate, relate process. Obviously there's key rules about not introducing evidence in a conclusion, and also utilising citations in the introduction in order to back up how you know these things. In the introduction, it's going to be okay for you to maybe cite rather than directly engage, because you'll do that within your essay, but obviously make your best judgment. The point about evidence is that you have to be sure it's coming from a suitable source. Academics, specialists, not just random websites or even websites that have been contributed by academics. You're better off with books and journals at all cases if you're looking at secondary sources, and primary sources are slightly different because they can come from websites. In fact, the majority of the primary sources you'll use and probably will come from a website, but make sure it's a reputable one. The argument here would be that if it's from somebody's blog, probably not great. Can we verify it? If it's from a library or a library website or even directed to you by a historian, then it's probably better. Again, use your best judgment, but remember, one of the things we do at the conclusion of marking your essay is go through your bibliography. Now, your citations and your bibliography are different. In a history essay, and in the humanities you may use Harvard referencing or footnotes. In a history essay, we almost exclusively used footnotes, which you'll know as Chicago referencing. Sometimes we use endnotes. Always refer back to the handbook of the course. The key thing here is to use the referencing style that you are told to. You can always get help with this. Any educational establishment will have services to support you, and if nothing else, your tutor and your lecturers will be very glad to talk you through it. Your handbook will always have examples, or your VLE, your virtual learning system, will have examples. Just look for them. Always try to use what the university tell you rather than just a random internet search, because you might get the wrong information even though you've tried your hardest. So best to check. The reason we're so pernickety about this is references allow us to know that you've got your information from the right source. So it's not led you up the garden path or told you the wrong piece of information. I'm not going to go any further into this because you could watch my source analysis video and how to source separately if you like, and I'll include the link. But the point here is that your bibliography is not your reference list. Your citations and your footnotes are what you have used in your essay as evidence. You've engaged with it, you've argued it. Whereas your bibliography is all of that plus everything else you have read and considered to get the knowledge you've needed to write your essay. We would not want to see just your citations in your bibliography. For me, I always look for up to double, because if you're going to write an essay, you need to do all the round reading first, and not everything is going to make its way into your essay. But at least then we know you've read the core texts. And in many cases, those core texts are the ones we tell you to read when giving you advice about your essay or in the tutorial or related to the lecture. So don't do hard work for yourself. Follow what we've told you to consider and read them through. And remember, we're not always looking for you to read something cover to cover. We're asking you to look at the key sections that go for you. What we're hoping you'll do is you'll pick up key text and you'll want to read it all the way through, or you'll use it. But there's a lot of text out there and a lot of topics, so it's always important to read what we suggest and make sure you glance through the introduction, if nothing else, in many of these pieces of information. If you're going to use it in your essay, you better make sure you've read it, because 9 times out of 10 we've read it and we remember it better than you do. So make sure you're including things that are right. And that is evidence. Finally, we end up with P, which is for presentation. Presentation is key. Presentation will make a lot of difference. I've already covered you about paragraphs, and that should be becoming clear about why we need these things. But presentation is key because there are key things we ask you to do, like the references. For example, like the references, if you're struggling with it, I would suggest that you go to the handbook or information we've given you, copy and paste the example we gave, because we always do, and use that as a template for every reference that you then go on and do. Because you don't have to mess around with commas and full stops and page numbers and the P for the page numbers, because we've done that. You just have to change the information. It'll make your life a lot easier, and always try and make your life easier. There's also software that you can use. Speak to your tutor about it. Your presentation isn't just things like references, but it's also about following the instructions we've given you. For example, we might ask it for it to be in a certain font. We might ask you to double space it. The reason for this is because we need them to be uniform, and we need to be able to see it clearly. For example, if you don't double space, then your paragraphs are going to look tiny. If you do double space, then we can use that space to mark in and read it, and we can judge it better. You might need to justify it. If we ask for things like a marking sheet, put on a marking sheet. It's really frustrating to have to go and add a marking sheet to a student's essay. Make it easier for your marker. It enhances goodwill. Also, remember silly things like titles. If you don't put a title on an essay, and then as your marker I have to try and work out what question you're answering in your introduction, I'm much more likely to be A, frustrated, and B, confused. If your conclusion isn't fantastic, then I'm going to get to the first body of your essay still not entirely sure what you're doing, and you're going to lose marks. Make it easier for me and you. In terms of your presentation, things like spell checking, reading back through, grammar checks are vital. Anything that will jar me away from marking your essay, is going to have an impact. You need to make sure that you've checked for these things. Now, there are many out there who may have issues with grammar and spelling. I myself have issues with dyslexia, but I know that I can use programs on the computer, online to help me, and your tutor, lecturer and student services can help you with that. And also I know ways in which I can help myself, because I tend to get someone to read my essay back to me. Not that I write essays anymore, but articles and things. I get friends and family to read it, and when I was doing my degree I would get individuals to read it back to me. Another way you could do it would be to read it out loud, record it and then listen back. Yes, it's excruciating, but you'll hear the bits that don't make sense, the words in the wrong places. The point here is take your time. Don't write it at the last minute. Don't write it the night before. And make sure you're planning. You might be one of these people who can fantastically write an essay the night before and get a great mark for it and run through. And we all hate you because well done you. One of my best friends can do that and I hate it. But ultimately when you get to a certain level, even that ability starts to wear down, because we need particular readings, presentation, considerations and analytical tools. We need all of this from you, and you can't do that the night before. You need a plan, you need a structure, you need linkage, you need knowledge, and you need evidence. So make sure that you take the time to do these things. So that's it. Sleep. State, debate, relate. Use these tools to get yourself a great essay. I know you can do it. Good luck.